We're in courses 01 in server 00, and with the package JSON you can see how we can start with GNOME on this particular one here, which you've got down here. And if I open up the playground, we can go into the browser and we can see we get the playground. A few things, we can change the tab name here if we want. We also have in settings where we can customize whether light or dark the fonts. One important point is polling enable set to false. Normally it's true, the default, which means it will send the query every 2 seconds. That can be useful in development, so instead of having to refresh the browser, but we're turning it off for this purpose here. So we save settings, we come back into test. And if we have a look back at our file again into server 00, we've set up Apollo server with our GQL, which is tag template function. This will demonstrate comments. We have one query called hello, which returns something of type string or nothing at all. It's not, doesn't have to, it can return null. If we want to say it has to return a string back, we would use the exclamation mark, the bang, to show that it is required, and we'll see that in the examples. So having defined in our schema that we have a query and there is one query called hello, we also have our schema definition where this root object query is associated with that query. And in the exercises we'll see that we can change this name here, although we don't tend to. And though things are defined in the schema, we must actually resolve what does that query do. And we say for our root query, we have a query called hello, and we're just going to send back hello. This is standard boilerplate Apollo server running on port 5000. So when we open it up here, if we go to the docs, we can see we've got one function hello, which returns a string. We see this comment up here, so we can actually add to documentation. We can also have a look at the schema itself, which has more information. We tend to look at the docs. So if we do command or control space, it'll help us with what we can do. We're interested in queries at the moment. So if we do open up our curly brackets, if we do command and space, we can see we've got available. We'll look at these later. These are for introspection to look at the query, but we can see our function hello here. We can click on it and we get back our result hello. So we can see we have our query here returning something. It is defined here. Let's make this, it has to be a string, and save. And in this example, let's just return nothing. Let's just return null. In fact, let's make it the null object, not a string. We do that, everything seems fine here. We come back here, we refresh, run it, cannot return null for non-nullable fields. So that's the use of the exclamation mark. So let's return that back to hello and back to that. Now let's have a look at a few things we can do. Schema is included by default, but shows why queries are a reserved word in the command. We can change this query here to anything we want. We could call it Q, then define it down here as Q, then define it here as Q, because all we're doing is basically saying that there is a query and we're just referencing the Q in the schema, and when we come down here, that query is Q here. If we save it, we can sort of see that everything runs fine okay here. Refresh the page, we get it back. So let's undo that. Can we comment out the schema? No, it needs to know that it has a query, a root object, and this, if we comment this out, we will sort of see that when we come back down here, this is running here. Let's just see if this works. And by default, this Q query is included in, it's optional, but if we had a different name down here, it wouldn't work because this is query here. So let's put this back in here. And for example, if we change this, we find all instances of this. If we change this to, let's just call this R, let's call this R, let's call this R. That's all working fine. It likes that. That's not a problem because it's just defining a particular query to the root. That works fine. But now if we comment out this, it by default is going to crash because it's expecting the query to have a query, expecting to have this query here of type query. So it's not standard default. So if we change the name, and that's why we don't tend to change this name here, we just always leave it as query. I mean, there's no need to change that name and for people to understand our code. So we always leave it like this, come back into the browser, refresh the page, click, we get hello here. When it comes to the resolvers, if it hasn't got it, it'll still work. You can see there's no clash here. All it will do is everything defaults to null in GraphQL, meaning that if something's not fully defined, it doesn't crash the whole application, it just returns null. So let's send that back in. But on the other hand, if we have something as a resolver and we don't have it in the schema, like here, GQL throws an error. That's fine there. We've seen how we can add the bang here, that means it is required, but here we can default back to null. And one other thing we can do now is actually look what is actually sent to the server. So if we go into the network tab here, close this and refresh, we can see that what gets sent across is that query down here. A little bit difficult to see with my screensaver, but you can see query hello here. Notice how a 200 is sent back. Now let's throw an error, and the way we can do that is basically in here is return an error on the server side, return throw error, and we need to put that Control X in here because it's an error. That return is not needed. If we do that, everything's working fine here. If we come back, refresh the page and send it, we get an error here, but if we notice, let's clear it and do it one more time. If we look in here, we still get a 200 because GraphQL, it's not an error being sent back, it's just that it's been an error on the server side. GraphQL handles it and sends back a message of the errors object. Now what we can do when we quickly look in here, if we come in here, and what else can we do? Subfields. If we however send a bad request, now for example if we ask for some subfields here, this will be different. This will be an error here. If we look at the F12, it's not a valid request to be sent, and if we do that again here, refresh it, we can see we get 400. So this is more of a client side, so it's a bad request as opposed to being an error on the server side. Finally, what we can do is if we want to sort of change how our output comes back, we may want to, for example, put an alias. So we may want to say reply dot hello. We send that through, and we need to refresh from the previous error. Let's just check that we have got that back in here. That's right. So let's just go back to the way that was and say, comment this out and send back hello. We save that. That's all working fine. Coming back here, refresh the page, get the query, run it. We can see we can change the nature of our response back, giving us the ability to shape the data as we wish. And we'll look at various other aliases that we can do. But we've seen in this one particular example here how requests are sent through posts, how we always get 200s back. We can basically also see how we can put comments. This comment here, for example, when we come in here and look in the docs, we can see this is a high level field. There is the definition here. We'll see more of that as we come through, but straight away here in this particular first video, we can see how we can get back customized data from GraphQL.